Welcome back to the Hermetic Podcast. We have Hadron back on, and we're gonna talk about our views on stuff like Solomonic magic. I believe that Hadron here has some issues with how evocation is performed in a lot of grimoires around Solomonic magic and maybe even some Arabic magic texts. So, would you like to talk to us about some of your hangups about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a magician, but I'm kind of like a natural school magician, right? But my thing about grimoires or conjurations is I have the feeling that they're like you and me. They have feelings, they have personal identities. You may think maybe they just have functions, but I think that many of them had um, they're personal. And when they're dealing with your conjuration, they may see you as there we go again, humans, manipulators. I hate them, and they may want to come in. Some of them may be opportunists, and but to come in and like, oh no, he's going to put the chains on me. He's going to bound me to do this and do that. I just think of it's a control system that you're going to try to get them to do to bring something that you're trying to bring about, whether it's riches, wealth, love, it's doing something bad or good. And I just think that it's kind of like just turning them into slaves, and it creates an automatic hostility, I think, with spirits. What
One
do you
thing I
think?
will say is that a lot of the demonic entities, regardless of what a lot of demonologers say, are in fact quite hostile towards humans. In fact, a lot of them will play the long game and try to convince you that working with them is this great idea. Well, I don't think that it's necessarily always 100% the worst idea in the world to work with spirits. I do think that trying to work with the demon as an equal is often a terrible idea because you mentioned earlier that these entities are indeed quite intelligent oftentimes. In fact, I would argue a lot of them are probably more intelligent than almost anybody who might pick up a grimoire to try to do some evocations. I think it's important to have a layer of safety, and binding these entities isn't necessarily always an issue of power and control so much as a safety layer, creating a buffer between the demonic entity and your life by use of angels and divine names, right? So I don't necessarily think it's a issue of master slave, as this is a pragmatic and necessary thing in order to ensure safety when I'm dealing with this class of entity. Because even if they are benevolent, which I don't necessarily think is the case in a lot of these cases, it is very important to have pragmatic um pragmatic things in place, like you can't necessarily always 100% care about the feelings of these entities, which in my opinion a lot of them might not actually be things that you can anthropomorphize, but that's just my take on it. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, okay. I wish I could recall. I may have brought it up on the air before, but there's this father and son duo. I've seen a video made where they're actually an exorcist team, and they found out the majority of spirits that they worked with had no no compromise about the pre-existing condition to fit into the theological makeup that they were doing. That our narrative is not necessarily true. There's actually extra dimensional entities that will pretend to do anything and everything just to screw with you, to feed off your energy, and boom, move on. They got the shits and giggles out of you, and it may not necessarily be bound. Oh my goodness, they're bound by God to do this and that. They'll just make you, through our arrogance and through a big game, it can be somewhat entertaining to them. It's like, look at them. They actually think they're controlling us, or they actually think that the words of Christ has got us bound, or these are multidimensional entities that are beyond our comprehension. And I just, and then even if you think there's weaker spirits, I mean, it's just, I think it's convoluted. I think a lot of there's a lot of assumption. We're just like mythology. We mythologize a lot of things. And I don't know if they're compartmentalizing the same concept as we are. And I have a doubt. I look as you know, I told you I have two gym, but I don't see them as I'm owning them. I really believe if you give them respectful ground, they will naturally want to work for you. But you also have to look at them as friendship. I don't see them as hostile. I think a lot what we turn into demons is more of our intent that makes them hostile. I do agree with you that there's naturally hostile to us, but I think it's more a natural predatory thing. I mean, the eagle is going to be naturally hostile to the snake. I mean, so it's more like a ecosystem. But I think you can make more enemies than you really need if you start bullying around the spirits and you think you got the big boys britches on for magic. I just think it could be a catch 22 on it. I think it's interesting. Grimoires of any kind, sure. When we probably put into practice, I do think it comes with dangers, which you know there's dangers, but why risk it? You know, what if one of these things are successful and gets through? Because you just commanded way too many commands and it says, I've had it. I'm going to do something back to you. And that's just my precautionary thing. I just think it's not worth it. And I do think that if you say, hey, a spirit, this kind of spirit, that, I like to see it as more like this is not a hostile agreement. And then I always ask my Jinn, what can I do for you? Not begging always, what can you do for me? And because I do think that the nice little sweet things in life can really make a difference between your relationship to entities.
To
It really
answer
is a companion.
to
Go ahead.
answer one of your questions that I think you kind of asked, why would somebody go about this whole evocation thing, right? Well, honestly, a lot of times you just need some entity that specializes in something that you might not be able to do so well. And that's where things like angels and demons come in, right? In an ideal world, we would do everything by means of angelic magic, right? But sometimes you might just need an entity that you can fully control by use of, you know, the techniques. So you just summon up the demon, you have all the precautions, you make sure you do everything right, and then the demon just goes about and does whatever you want it to do or tries to provide you with more opportunities to obtain X amount of knowledge in some area. So there is a point to it. A lot of times you're not going to need to do it unless it's just about practicing the evocation itself, which, in my opinion, has its own merits for the sake of knowledge. But, as you said, be careful. A lot of the grimoires do have many warnings about some of the things that you've talked about. Entities will try to deceive you into thinking that they're bound when they, in fact, are not even remotely close to being bound. So, yes, it's very important to take all of these really, really important cautionary messages into account when dealing with especially stuff
Yep.
like demons and even Fae if you like use the Book of Oberon. So the whole idea is yes, there is a general point to this. Even Solomon in legend employed demons to help build the temple. Don't know how seriously I take that, but it's just a common example. But anyway.
Right. Well, I think we also talked about, as we led up to this, we talked about the theological implications and your soul's implications upon death. The
Yep.
theological implications, like, okay, so obviously anyone from an outside point of view will call it witchcraft, right?
Oh
But
yeah.
yet there may be protected terms says, well, no, not. You may want to back off from the term, but it's still the same equivalence from pretty much 9 out of 10 definitions outside the craft. Um, but like, What do you think the implications if there's a supreme God that you believe in? Do you think that supreme God really approves of that, or does not approve? And you know,
I
where are you going to draw the line?
I do have a bit of a nuanced take on this. At least I would like to think it's nuanced. I believe that if you are acting completely in accordance with God's will and you are actually performing evocation properly, I think that is perfectly valid within the Christian tradition. And I don't think that witchcraft was quite as all encompassing in early Christianity until, well, I know that you like to talk about Constantine, so I actually agree with you on this. I think that the early church was kind of fine with some Greco Roman magic back in the early church until it was officially, anathematized in the early canons of the church. Like, yeah, there was always some problems with paganism, idolatry, misuse of divine forces, and concepts for personal gain outside of glorifying God, right? That's always been there's always been some issue with that, especially in early Christianity and even in Judaism, right? But I don't think that the overall 100% hard ban was really a thing until probably the time of Constantine. Now, I don't necessarily believe it was 100% about mind controlling the population. There could have been a little bit about that. But realistically, a lot of the early church canons were about trying to preserve the integrity of the early church teachings. So I can't really fault them for doing what they did, but I know that you have a different opinion on that.
Well, I do think that I think there's been evidence found that early Christians did use the five-sided star and six-sided star for magic purposes. There were some fringe Christianities, but at the same time, Christianity was not one coherent force until Constantine came in, and even then, you still get the schisms later down the road. Christianity could not ever be contained in the one stream. It
While
was
I
bound
do,
in different directions.
while I do appreciate the fact that there was like early schisms like Gnosticism, Arianism, and stuff like that. One thing I will push back on is I do believe that early Christianity was largely coherent despite some of the differing ideas, like on the natures of Christ, um, some of the essence energy arguments, things like that. So yeah, a lot of early Christianity, especially in the so-called early apostolic church, was pretty coherent up until at least the third century. Well, at least the third century. So yeah, even there a lot of these schools of thought were already considered to be fringe ideas to some extent. But
Petrine, Petrine and Pauline Christianity were at war up until Constantine. Constantine, who was a warlord and a serial killer himself, wanted to put an end to it and consolidate the state. So there wasn't a coherency. It depends, I guess, which scholar you're talking to. Uh, I mean, you can already see in the New Testament who they're calling each other. You're the wolf in sheep's clothing. It was
well, I
Pauline
mean,
and Petrine
yeah, that was there was a
because
lot
they
of
were at war with each
there
other.
was a lot of theological debate within the church that's not contested. Like, yeah, that's pretty well known.
Yeah, it turned into bloodbaths. It was, yeah, it was were they killing off each other? But
Oh,
but
yeah.
even on that, it can you can go into a tangent on that. My thing is we both agree there was magical elements of the Christianity. There's
Absolutely.
magical elements with the Judaism that you can find in some old simple Jewish culture where you can stand in the center. Even Judaism wasn't coherent. Like you could have a Jewish temple in Syria that totally different had a lot of different beliefs in a Jewish temple in Greece or Judea. That they all mixed different pagan elements around their culture. It wasn't like a deep root. I am Jewish and nothing else. Judaism and Greek and Roman, they all blended with each other. You can see invocations of Io, which
Oh yeah.
it looked like more of an occult Solomon school rather than a clear religion. if you really look at
Oh
things.
yeah,
Uh,
syncretism was definitely a big thing back in the day. Still is, but yeah. The Bible really does go out of its way to address it, even like in the Old Testament, though. So,
some would swear that the Bible itself is a magic manual, and that's what its
oh
original truth
yeah,
was.
it's at least a grimoire in addition to a theological text. Although, in my opinion, there isn't really much of a difference between those two things. Like there is, but there also isn't.
Right. Yeah. So I do believe that magic is natural. I mean, it's impossible to be not a magician in this age if you want to be in touch with nature. And I understand the curiosity to go, but it's still a lot of like a murky territory. And you'll believe it or not. You look at the opportunity. I look at the precautions, and you say, well, yeah, let's be cautious, but still too much opportunity waits. And I
Oh
agree with
yeah.
you. There's a lot of amazing opportunity with spirits. But I think there's a lot of pitfalls with them too. And you just have to one has to be careful which ones you line up with. I personally, I think everyone should guide with something.
Oh yeah.
Um, it's your
Honestly,
personal
even
opinion,
honestly, with the Solomonic magic, I don't even necessarily see it as an opportunity to get X from this entity. It's a lot of times just about personal growth, through development of a skill. And you never know when it's going to be useful. Probably never will unless you're explicitly doing magic, right? But
right?
maybe one day
You,
you somehow come upon, I don't know, maybe a demonic infestation or something. Now you have some techniques to deal with it if you're really good at Solomonic magic, right? Or, I mean,
well,
weird hypothetical, but
I told you the other month I got in touch with my higher self, and it really communicated like a little bit of a snake. It had a hiss to it, and I found it hissing me at two different occasions. And so I looked at that as my daemon, and I was like, okay, if that's dealing with me, I'd hate for someone else to manipulate that form. If I was disincarnate, that would be the form I would be communicating to. And it'd be scary, like let's say you pass away or I pass away. What if we get caught up and, bound because of the way we are? What if you find yourself being bound? I mean, I have my personal opinion about jinn. I do think there's a spirit side to them and a human side, just like to us. Like fairies, humans, whatever, they're all people at one time, and then when you die, you fall into categories. I've met many people who swear that they were actually, fairies, or they were. I've met one person who's a salamander. There's one man I know right now. He says when he dies, he's going to go back to ocean. I said, yeah, you're a water spirit. Um, so it's kind of like, hey, really, is there any difference between those spirits and humans? When you die, you may find out you may have more in common than you think, and you never know that you'll be on the other side of the coin where a magician is conjuring you, and you're just looking for plasma energy, and you're looking for any opportunity for human interaction. And but magician is the only one that's really going to talk to you. I've often looked at it like that. We're spirits. Are we really so different than what we're conjuring? Uh, you know, I think a lot of dead people come back as spirits. Like if you're an alcoholic, well, a spirit of an alcoholic's going to want to possess you because they're going to participate in the same indulgence. Someone who's addicted to sex may want to hang around with pornographic sites, or someone who's a sex addict, or they may
um,
want to pet. So there, I do think that we can partake of things without even realize that we're part of the circle.
I won't pretend to fully understand the distinctions between classes of entities, but I do genuinely think that different types of beings do actually employ a different. How do I say this properly? I think that some beings are inherently different and are embedded into reality such that they perform different types of functions, right? Like I think that an angel is going to be different type of entity than a demon, which is probably going to be different from a jinn. Because I do actually take the Islamic magic kind of seriously. Well, interestingly enough, I will have had Islamic magician on tomorrow, and it'll probably be released before this episode. But that's just something to talk about later. And I think that these entities are different than even humans. I don't really believe that you can 100% conflate one class of spirit with another. Now, can a human do things similar to a demon after death, like you say? I think that that's an interesting question. I'm inclined to say possibly, but seems like a bit of a cop out. But
Well,
I think it's worth exploring, probably.
my position, I take on a more anthropological view of demons as well. I found that the Aztec world was an inspiration, or let's say not just Aztec, but the Mayan world especially, when they were able to travel beyond their locations into other lands. They were known as demons wherever they went. When Columbus came and he saw these people, he referred to them as demons in his manuals, and so did the people on his ship. They literally see centuries ago, demons were considered manifest in real human form. We have a concept that we think that demons are only spirits and humans are only flesh. When I think in an anthropological way, it was more mixed up. Like devas were really the Hindu devas of India. They were actually
Um,
real warrior kings. Angels were Anglo-Saxons. Um, like
I
the
think
Sakari well, let me finish this.
okay.
Remember when Jesus cast the demons into the pigs, the story? Well, there's been scholars point out that this is actually just a reference, really, to just demean the Sakari. They were the assassins, Jewish assassins that would be known to stab people in the Roman markets. They can get a good one, slash the neck of a Roman soldier when he's caught alone. Uh, so this can actually be like a style to get back at the Jews for their little assassins. How dare you? There's a little innuendos within the story that Roman.
Uh,
There's a lot of Roman storytelling that's happening in the story, an allegory. So that's why, like, when it comes to demons versus humans, it gets kind of muddy and crisscross when you look at a lot of stories in the past. I think a
well,
lot of them were not ancient gods.
I think that one of the key distinctions between something like a human and an angel, and maybe to an extent demons, is that angels are more defined by their function, their name, their function, and their identity are kind of the same thing, right? Humans, on the other hand, as we are, especially if you take the hermeticum kind of seriously, are able to be repositories of all of the celestial energies. They're able to have more than one function. They're able to experience more than one thing. And I might be a little too vague or maybe not very precise with this right now, but I think that's one of the key differences between, you know, us and them, if you want to turn it into that, which I kind of do.
Yeah,
Um,
and you have a purely metaphysical slash spiritual interpretation. Mine is more like I interpret priest and angel as alternative, two sides of the
well,
same coin. Priests in
honestly,
ancient times were often considered angels when later got written down in books.
Honestly, there's a little more nuance to it than that. I think that there are layers of reality where different types of beings inhabit, different layers. And I think that different types of beings have different functions, right? So the most obvious one is the difference between the physical, astral, and so called etheric world, right? I think that at different layers of reality, you have beings that literally perform different functions. And I don't know. It just seems to me like like conflating different beings with one another could be dangerous, especially if you're trying to work with them. And it can actually bear more fruit if you try to be precise about what you're dealing with and what the capabilities of said entity are, right? Because if you tried to use a technique on an etheric spirit, an etheric being or a spiritual being that is pure spirit, and you tried to apply the same technique to an astral being that is purely mind for, it could work, but it also might not work because, it's two different, it is two completely different, what do you call it? It's two different it's two entirely different types of entity, right? So I'm not saying that you can't conflate some aspects of different types of beings, but I am saying that sometimes it might not be beneficial to do so.
All right. Well, see, all right. So I still want to provide a contrast here. So, all right, you and I, we're four-layered beings. You have an astral, which is made of orgone. You have your spirit that's made of plasma. You have your mind, which is like a type of scalar, and then you have your body. Okay, there's four levels to you right now. You, all right. So to divide up these layers, how do we know we only got a fragment of a being? If I just take your astral layer, there's 1/4 of you right there. It's not fully you. That's why some poltergeists may only be a fraction of a whole being, and not necessarily a whole being itself. But I want to add another contrast here. Andrew Collins, who wrote a book from the Ashes of Angels, very fascinating book, talks about angels as actually real shamanistic tribes from 8,000 12,000 years ago, and leading all the way up until the Sumerian age, they would be known as angels. They were really dressing up in garb where they actually had literal wings from vultures. They dressed in as shamans, right? Then you had the other cults who would dress up in lizards and snakeskin. They would be later known as demons. These were our culture bearers who've contributed to a lot of what we call so-called fallen angels or the battle between angels and demons. They were shamanistic cultures that may have had clashes sometimes. Though maybe the one of the world's first ancient police forces may have been a shaman culture. You see this happening back then, where they literally had police forces
I think
unmanned
we're
with
um
babes.
I think where our worldviews probably do kind of agree is I do think that there were indeed shamans that probably dressed up as these things. But I think that the beings that they either became or inspired or created were probably more astral beings, whereas the beings that you would try to deal with more on the Solomonic side would probably be more pure spiritual. I do think that the distinction is important, and again, I don't always like ragging on Thelema as much as it seems, but I think a lot of Thelemites have a serious problem when making these kind of category errors themselves. Um,
Well,
so yeah, I do
well,
think you're right. I do think that these things probably occurred to some extent, but I do think that it's important, at least from an operative perspective, to note that what you're talking about might be more astral beings, but you might disagree. It's
well,
fine, but
well, no. I see. See, the thing is, here's a twist. When these people die, their characteristics carry on into the so-called plasma world or orgone world, known as
mm,
the spirit / astral world. There, when all your traditions become one with your spirit when you die. So it's not like their spirits are gone. They still may show up as that angel in your vision or in your conjuration. Like I think a lot of folklore, of royals who died, who were part of the royal dragon bloodlines, they will really manifest as fairies in Ireland and Wales, out in the farmlands. So it's not like these things. It's not like it's you either take this worldview or that. They will take their characteristics. Like all your characteristics you take on will develop an afterlife arrangement. So
fair
everything
enough.
you do will there.
We are running out of time though, but I don't know.
Yeah.
One thing I will say before I sign us off is that the one problem that I have with this worldview, if anything, is that it seems to conflate things that are probably, a lot more distinct than one might think at face value. But We can get into that later, but anyway, I'd like to thank you for coming on, and I'd love to have you on again. This has been the Hermetic
All right.
Podcast, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.